Where'd Bob go? Oh, thanks to Bob for bringing in Michael Ryan Bell. He's the #1 pot guy, I say, in the world, because...
What kind of pot you're talking about?
Best case scenario outside of Japan.
Yeah, and he comes out every so often, but yeah, we're lucky that Bob signed him up, and we got him here, and thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's talk about some pots. Can we get the lights?
Yeah, you ready?
Okay. Yeah. I'm just going to get right into it. So today we're going to talk about bonsai containers. So, you know, I know you guys have artists coming through all the time doing workshops with trees. You know, we don't, in this country, I think, focus on containers enough. In Japan, they get very, very detailed with containers in ways that we'll talk about in a minute that we just don't think about here in the U.S. So we're going to talk about the history, appreciation, classification, and identification of containers in traditional bonsai art. These are the topics that we're going to talk about. First, unsurprisingly, the history of bonsai containers begins just like the history of bonsai in China. So bonsai-specific pottery, like bonsai itself, began around 1400 with minimally decorated terracotta containers. Although terracotta here is capitalized, I mean terracotta here in the royal sense, as in the literal sense, just earthenware. These are going to be very, very rare to find whole and unbroken and uncracked, because these containers were basically not fired very high the way we like them today, so they've been ravaged by time. More modern forms of bonsai pottery were first imported into Japan from China around the 17th century. It's important to note this for multiple different reasons. For one, we can understand a lot about the way Japan assesses cultural history and their environment, but also for the longest time, probably up until the mid-70s, the Japanese bonsai artists and pottery collectors of stuff with holes in the bottom, us, were not concerned with when a container was made. They were only concerned with when it became relevant to the Japanese. So when you hear terms such as Kowatari, Nakawatari, Shinwatari, these are literal terms that mean old crossing, new crossing, and middle crossing. It means when it crossed from China into Japan, quite literally. This creative naming penchant the Japanese have, we'll see continued throughout as a theme. So most of the containers imported into Japan from China in these periods were imported from Yixing, and a smaller portion from Canton. Canton specializes in glazed ware, whereas Yixing ware is going to be unglazed. I think it's important to note what these regions specialize in, because what we're talking about here is basically medieval societies. Nobody is importing clay. Nobody is importing glazed materials. People are using what they have locally to make beautiful products. So when we look at Canton, they specialize in glazeware. They have local clay that, at best, we can say it's humble. At most honest, we can say it's just crap. It's garbage. It's terrible. It can't be high-fired. It's filled with sand, which forms glass, makes it very fragile. So it's just very bad clay. So they invented these glazes to cover up what they had locally to make something beautiful out of what they had. It's important to note that it's not just that all of these talented potters come from these areas. It's that they happen to have the good stuff where they live. And they developed these recipes based on what they had to do to make beautiful containers. So classification by age that we just mentioned a second ago. Kowatari is old crossing, quite literally. This is before 1816. This is the oldest classification of antique Chinese containers. These are going to be pots over 200 years old. Obviously, the rarest of pots that exist out there, most not intended to be bonsai containers originally. Most intended to be other things like braziers or tea ceremony, fire pits, things like that. Nakawatari is middle crossing. This is the bulk of our antique Chinese containers. So pots that are 100 to 200 years old. And this is 1816 to 1911. Shinwatari, new crossing, 1911 to 1940. And then we have Shinwatari, again, creative penchant for naming, new crossing, 1940 to 1989. And then we have this catch-all term that Japanese professionals use for anything that's new in Chinese. So if it was made after 1940, and it's Chinese, and it's of decent quality. They'll just call it Shinto. So Shinto can mean anything from 1940 up to basically 1994, 1995 or so. They'll say something's new Chinese or, you know, kind of nouveau if it's newer than the mid-90s. So some Kowatari pots we'll take a look at. These were imported into Japan again before 1816 and ages ranged from 200 to 500 years old. Now, a minute ago I mentioned that the Japanese were only concerned with when containers were imported into Japan up until the 1970s. The bulk of antique Chinese containers were imported into Japan in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, we have this huge economic boom in Japan. Those of us that were alive, actually saw it here in the US. We have, you know, cars and electronics and all of this stuff. You can actually track the progress of bonsai and its popularity in Japan with the economy and how it goes up. And as the economy goes up in Japan, bonsai becomes more popular. All Japanese traditional arts become more popular, and the Japanese start buying everything the Chinese have to offer. So the vast majority of antique Chinese pots were imported in Japan in the 70s, and these crossing terms kind of started to lose their original meaning of when they were imported into Japan. But it still kind of sticks there as kind of a Japanese way of looking at the rest of Asia. Here's an example of a Kowatari container that's around 300 years old. It's kind of tough to see this picture, but it's a really deep, rich red round with a really highly decorative feet. It's really rare to see containers like this that are really ornate, really decorative, that are really old like this. As I said before, most of these containers were not originally intended for bonsai. They were going to be what we look at here as the common boxy rectangle. So at least 50 to 60% of the Kowatari containers that you see out there are these just big rectangles with gigantic rectangular holes in the bottom. These were originally braziers. They would go in the floor of the tea house, and you would build a fire, or you would build a fire in them to grill things on top of with grates. You would clean them out and have airflow with these huge holes in the bottom. These were not originally intended to be planters. And some of them you can still see some of the signs of them being used as such on the interior, especially some of the shallower ones that were used fairly recently. So a few trees from the Kokufu 10 and Kowatari containers. If you're familiar, I'm sure, with the Kokufu 10, this is the largest bonsai show in Japan. So the largest bonsai show in the world and the most respected. On the left, we have a 5-needle pine in Goyamatsu in a Kowatari square container. This is just a square version of the common boxy rectangle. Seeing a square version is a little bit rarer than the rectangle. And on the right, we have a black pine, a Kuromatsu, in a bag-shaped container, a Fukuro pot. Not as popular here in the US as they are in Japan. Very, very, very frequently seen in the Nakawatari period. Very rare to see really old versions of this bag-shaped container, and as a result, they're highly prized. Nakawatari containers are going to be the bulk of our antique Chinese containers. These are going to be when we start to see artists being proud of making bonsai pots. This is important, and it's important to note that amongst potters in China and Japan, bonsai and anything having to do with dirt is seen as second-class pottery work. It's just, there's a general idea, especially in Japan, when it comes to how you display things in the tokonoma and how dirt can't touch the mat in your tokonoma and things like that. We put moss on our bonsai just to keep the soil off of the mat in your display area. So this kind of prejudice against dirt is why we have a prejudice in general in the pottery community against anyone who makes anything that comes in contact with it. And it's very important that here in the Nakawatari period, we start to see artists actually signing their work. Famous artists that were famous for vases and teaware, other daily use items, really highly respected potters in other fields of pottery are actually marking their wares, their bonsai wares, as being made by them. This is a huge revelation and it's something that really starts to create a little bit of an acceptance among the pottery community of bonsai potters. but it never really actually goes away all the way. There's still that prejudice exists. There's a story about in the middle part of the 20th century, supposedly the greatest of Chinese potters that ever lived, one of the 7 great masters, one of his apprentices took a commission order for 300 small bonsai containers, mame containers, very, very small bean-sized pots. And he made them. When the master found out about it, he smacked his apprentice around because this was not done. This was dishonorable. He had besmirched the name of the 7 great masters by making these things that were going to come into contact with dirt. And this is just the 1970s. So this kind of prejudice against bonsai pottery in general, and how you can put me in a room with some porcelain experts and we don't even speak the same language, just never really kind of goes away. In addition to seeing artists starting to mark their work, you're going to start to see diversity of form and origin. So you're going to see more regions than just Yiqing and Canton producing bonsai containers made specifically for artistic trees. They're going to be shallower and with more similar proportions to what we would use today, whereas in the previous era, Kobatari pots are going to be much more narrow front to back and generally deeper than what we like, especially for our deciduous trees. Here's an example of a Nakawatari purple clay moko shape with Neko Ashi. Neko Ashi used to be really, really popular in China and Japan, but you don't see them anymore. Really, they've kind of fallen out of favor. It means cat claw feet. So like the Maneki Neko, the waving cat. So yes, Neko Ashi are just cat paw feet. These are unique because there are actually 5 little toe beans instead of the standard 3. But you're going to see these frequently in the Nakawatari period, not so much anymore. I'd really like to show this pot. It's just a simple little yellow pot, but it's about 110, 120 years old. It's a very rare yellow glazed rectangle with an inset window and lip. If you look in the tokenomic catalogs from the 80s and 90s, you will see an identical container in an identical glaze and an identical size made by the Yamaki kiln. In every single way, it's the same container. And there's a pretty high chance that this container, or one just like it, was used to produce the mold that the Yamaki kiln was actually making this pot out of. For a long time, several of the tokenomic kilns leading up to the 1997 crash had huge collections of antique Chinese containers that they would use to make molds that they were then making pots out of. A few trees from the Kokufu tin in Nakawatari containers. Middle crossing antique pot. On the left we have a buna, a Japanese beech. This is in an oval Namako pot. So Namako is a sea cucumber glaze. It's like a dark rich blue with hints of brown and white. Very, very popular with trees with white bark. And on the right we have a Satsuki in a Nakawatari rectangle Cantonese container. Again, the Cantonese containers were the one we were talking about with that slightly shady clay. We'll talk about more in a minute. And here we have, on the left, an Ezo spruce in a Nakawatari Nanban yaki. This might create some cognitive dissonance for some of you that are familiar with Nanban style and Nanban pots, because it's a rectangle. So, Nanban is one of the few things that I have in common with other pottery experts when we get into a room, and other Japanese historical artisans and things like that. Nanban is kind of an insulting term that the Japanese use as a catch-all thing for anything from Southeast Asia and southern China. It means southern barbarians. So Nanban is not this kind of round livestock feeding trough or jar dish that we're familiar with to house literati or bunjinji style trees. It's actually a region that produces some really, really rustic clay. So it's the clay in the region that defines Nanban yaki, not this round kind of rustic wabi-sabi shape that we're so used to being referred to as Nanban. And here on the right, we have a Toyo Nishiki quince in a Nakawatari Kinyo Yaki oval. I don't know if I didn't explain this. Sometimes I totally get lost in the terms and just assume everybody knows what I'm saying. So yaki just means burn. Just like, so when you go chicken skewers. Yakitori. Yaki means burned, grilled, cooked, fired in this case. So it just means made in or made by when it's used in this sense. So when we say something is kinyo yaki, it just means kinyo made or kinyo originated. So this Toyota Shiki quince here is in my favorite pot ever. If you follow the Kokufu 10, every year this blue bag-shaped container pops up with a different tree, a different species. Sometimes it's a flowering tree, sometimes it's deciduous, sometimes it's in leaf, sometimes it's out of leaf. Different styles, different shapes, masculine, feminine, everything. And it wins the Kokufu 10 at least 3 or 4 times a decade. It's just incredible to see all of the different styles that this pot can house. All the different trees that this pot has housed. It's interesting because there are only 4 in existence that have this mottled darker blue and light blue kinyo glaze. This one pops up every single year at the Kokufu 10. It's rented out every week for 1 week, 2 weeks now that they do the 2-week show and flip it. 2 weeks, $12,000. Wow. It's a lot. Yeah. And it's a little bit crazy. If you place this pot to sell on the open market in China, it would probably fetch $150,000. So, you know, this is one of the few items that no one's ever going to sell in Japan back to China. The vast majority of other antiques have already kind of repatriated back home, but this one just makes no financial sense to sell, and it gets rented out again every year.
Michael, who owns that pot now?
I can't actually say. All of the four examples that exist of this particular robin's egg kinyo glaze, 3 are owned by a very famous artist who's kind of short, loves to golf, and has a part on the side of his head. Maybe 2 S's in his name. And the other one is owned by a golfer. And if you know bonsai and golf, then it's jumbo. So shimatari containers are new crossing pots. What we're talking about here is actual shimatari, so things that are made 1911 to 1940. It's important to note this period more than the other 2 periods we talked about, really, because this is when we start to see the decline of Chinese skill with bonsai containers. And it's all a matter of popularity and economics. As I said before, you can really trace everything that has to do with bonsai as, as something that hobbyists do with their disposable income, with the economy. So 1911 to 1940, we start to see bonsai becoming more popular in Japan. You start to see people collecting shippaku from the mountains, for example, in this period, and they start to fetch extremely high prices. As a result, bonsai is getting more popular, people have more disposable income, they have more time on their hands, and bonsai artists are popping up and they want more stuff from China. So they're commissioning pots to be made, and as they're commissioning more and more pots to be made, the quality immediately starts to drop. And we start to see this shift from handmade, artistic, artisanal pots to the mass-produced Chinese stuff. We start to see that lasts maybe a season or 2, anywhere where it freezes, which you guys don't have to worry about, which I envy. A season or 2 where it freezes, in the 1970s and 80s, where it just starts to go downhill here in this period and never really recovers until the mid-90s anyway. So here's an example of shimatari containers. These are actually some of the better examples that are out there, and I think this is a good example of one we can look at that's tough to actually tell. So this container is right on the cusp of being Nakumatari and Shimatari. It'll be over here when we turn the lights on for the break. It's really tough to tell what period it's from because the quality is good in every single way, but just the general shape of the drainage and everything else says it's Shimatari. But the quality, the attention to detail, the clay itself, and the burnishing, someone took a rock to this on the outside of this before it went into the kiln and polished this in a certain way that you can only get by hand polishing for hours and hours and hours. So this is really tough to say when it was made. I'm going to lean towards the Nakawatari period, but say 1911, because the quality is too good for it to be this 1911 to 1940 period. Now, when we look at these two containers here, you can see in the top one, it's just kind of cracked. It's muddy around the feet. The details are off. There's a bow in the center where it kind of warps in. Like, you don't see that kind of stuff in real, legit, artisanal, antique Chinese pots. The one on the bottom, the glaze is beautiful, the pot is beautiful, but the clay itself it's unnatural. It's just obviously a very, very refined porcelainous clay. It's not like the natural clays that we'll see in the previous antique artisanal period. So, a few trees from the Kokufu 10 in Shinto containers. And here I mean Shinto not in the royal sense, but in the literal sense, as in brand spanking new Chinese stuff. So, here on the left, we have an Arakawa Momiji, a rough bark Japanese maple, in a Shinto Kinyo oval. On the right, we have a Shinpaku Kishu Bonsai, which is a recognized cultural masterpiece bonsai. These are trees that aren't allowed to leave Japan. There's a whole selection process, money's involved. It's a whole thing. You get a little tag. But Kishu Bonsai automatically accepted into the Kokufu 10, which is important to note. And it is in a brand spanking new, etched, unglazed container. So again, you might have some cognitive dissonance if you're familiar with the Kokufu 10, because it's commonly been believed among us here in the West that the pots, the containers used in Kokufu have to be, high quality or antiques. In fact, it's even believed so by the judges. There was an American who showed a Shinpaku in the show 7 or 8 years ago now, and when he got the tree accepted, he was going to change the container to a Sarah Rayner container. And the judges told him that his acceptance for this tree would be rescinded if he changed the tree to the Sarah Rayner container, because all of the containers in Kokufu have to be high quality and antique. This isn't true, however, as we just saw that those two trees were in brand spanking new Chinese pots. One of the reasons for this is that Kishu Bonsai are automatically accepted into Kokufu 10. Nobody's going to pay $12,000 to rent a pot when they don't have to. I mean, everybody's human and everybody's a little bit cheap sometimes. But when you're automatically getting accepted, there's no chance of winning a Kokufu prize. They're not repotting, and they're just submitting the trees in brand spanking new Chinese pots. Another reason for this is that in many cases, the right container can no longer be found in Japan that fits the tree. Because, as I mentioned earlier, so many antique Chinese pots have repatriated back to China from Japan post-1997, 1998, when the economy broke. Pretty much 75–85% of all the antique Chinese containers that we saw throughout the years in the Kokufu 10 are now back in China, and they'll never leave again. So the containers just don't exist except for new stuff. And it's difficult to find new stuff from Tokoname that's large, shallow, and glazed in certain colors. So there are a couple reasons why we do see brand new Chinese pots and brand new Japanese pots in the Kokufu 10, despite what the judges may say. So I took one Kokufu exhibition album, just the first one I grabbed here when I was writing this lecture, and it's 77. So there are 457 containers that were shown total in this. 30 were Kowatari, so 30 that are over 200 years old, 259 Nakawatari, so around 2/3 antique total. 147 Japanese pots. And of those Japanese pots, almost none, like maybe 3, were antique. So all made within the last 40 or 50 years, mostly in the 70s Tokoname level containers, and 12 stones. So this general misconception we have in the West about the quality level and snobbiness of the Kokufu and containers is a little bit misplaced. So the second classification of bonsai containers we're going to look at is fire tin. This is way more important to people that don't live here. Like where I live where it freezes, we really have to know this. But here, I have seen many terracotta containers that are 20 or 30 or 40 years old because you guys don't freeze, so it's not nearly as important. But for everywhere else, this is like the first thing that we have to look at as far as classifying our containers. So it's important to note that for the Chinese, originally there were only two different firing tins. There was porcelain and not porcelain. So it was basically, there was terracotta and porcelain. So everything that was high fired enough up to stoneware level was considered porcelain. And then everything that wasn't vitrified was considered just earthenware. For the Japanese, they break it down a little bit more stringently into terracotta or earthenware. This is the lowest fired level of clay pottery that we have. It is not fully vitreous, which means it absorbs water. What this means as far as frost is concerned is not that it's frost-proof, which is like the silliest thing that's ever been said. It's like saying that a watch is waterproof. It's not. Best, it's water-resistant. Nobody's still testing that. It means that the clay body itself is porous enough to absorb water on the inside of the body that can then freeze and fracture the clay body internally as the water expands and dies. That's all the vitriosity and absorption info you really ever need to know. You do get some containers that are falling apart, really new cheap Chinese containers due to heat stress, but that's a little bit rare. Stoneware are fired to 1100 to 1300 degrees Celsius. These are fully vitrified and frost-proof or frost-resistant at best. And as anyone who lives in Rochester can tell you, even frost-resistant is a misnomer because any container, no matter how high it's fired, is going to shatter if it's got a tree root ball that is waterlogged inside of a pot that has nowhere to go. I did an appraisal for Bill Valavanus when I first started doing this, and he had the most beautiful Senchu Ichio container. It was a very, very famous, very, very rare potter. It was given to him by a very famous artist, and it was just shattered. And it basically had an internal lip, and the root ball froze when it was waterlogged. Shattered this pot, $8,000 pot. He had no idea. Apparently, Mr. Yoshimura did not share the information when he gifted it to him, that it was extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily great example of the author's work. And porcelain we have is 1350 to 1400 degrees plus Celsius. Porcelain is a unique thing when you look at how the Japanese look at aesthetics and life in general, actually, really. So there's this general idea about dichotomies and opposing forces in all of Japan. It runs through everything. The stories that they love, the different kinds of things they artistically appreciate. So for porcelain, when you have just like a simple little vase or something, or not so much with bonsai pots, because what we intend to do is different from what you do with regular porcelain. But for just like a little teacup, the mark of quality is if you can hold it up to a candle or a light bulb, and if you can see through it, if you can see the light through the porcelain. So basically what we're talking about is the hardest thing that human beings can make with fire and clay, that is also at the same time the most fragile thing that human beings can make with clay and fire. So this opposing dichotomy we see a lot in Japanese aesthetics and what they appreciate, and porcelain is one of the best examples of that. Its brittleness and strength have an opposing dichotomy of force, wabi-sabi if you will, yin-yang if you won't. So the Great Oak Kilns regions is another way we classify pots. Probably the most common way that you'll see antique Chinese pots classified other than by age. And first up we have Yixingware. I mentioned earlier that all of these were feudal societies where these containers were originally coming from. So Yixing has this huge, huge natural reserve of clay. It's not that they have great potters making unglazed pots from there, they just have the best clay. Tokoname is the other huge source of really, really nice unglazed clay. So there's nothing inherent about Yixing or Tokoname or Canton when it comes to their particular types of pottery, other than the stuff that they have locally that they're able to dig up. For Yixing specifically, these pots will never exist again. The mines flooded in the mid-'80s, and so the clay just doesn't exist anymore. There are at least 5 locations in the United States that definitely have exactly the same naturally occurring clays. There's just no doubt that it's there, but it costs prohibitively to dig it up. Americans aren't interested in pottery the way that Asians appreciate it. I mean, up until the mid-'90s, you could go buy a jar of pickles in the store in Japan, rather than it being in a glass jar, it could be in a little ceramic jar. There's a different connection to pottery in general that we don't have. So, there's just no reason that people aren't digging it up here, but no reason that they would either. So, Yixing is most known for purple clay. When you hear Zisha, or purple clay, purple sand, used as a term, it really means brown, with notes of purple that you can look in very high quality examples that are pretty rare. We'll look at some when we turn the lights on in a minute. So, unglazed clay types. These are all present in all of the different regions that we just talked about. Yixing, Tokoname, various places in the United States. Generally speaking, you don't find pure veins of any one type of clay. You find various pockets of different types of clays that are just mostly vermilion or purple with veins of yellow or coral, these kinds of things. It's important to really look at the clay colors. When I talked earlier about how much thought the Japanese put into their container choices, I think I hear a lot when I travel that there's a lot that has to do with tradition when the Japanese choose containers for certain things. Like, black pines go in Zisha containers and purple glazed, unglazed pots, and, Shinpaku go in red glazed, unglazed pots. But why? When I started asking that question to artists in Japan, the answer surprised me. So, for black pines being matched with shude pots. Shude pots, again, are brown with notes of purple. Black pines are matched to this particular color, not because it accentuates the bark itself, but because the notes of purple accentuate the shadows between the plates of bark, making the bark look thicker. So the purple notes actually accentuate the shadow, making the bark look thicker, which that to me is just absolutely incredible. And for Shinpaku, for example, which is commonly planted in these vermilion red clay pots, the reasons why are pretty obvious. This red color, bright red, contrasts with the white deadwood. This white deadwood is the feature we want to show off in our Shinpaku, right? Just like with black pines, the feature we want to show off is the bark. This is our key feature. This is what we're looking to show off. But what if you don't want to show those things off? What if you're like Kimura, who doesn't need to show off the deadwood? In fact, he needs to play it down. He does the opposite. If you look at Kimura's trees, he actually plants many of his Shinpaku in purple pots because he doesn't need to play up the deadwood by contrasting with this red clay. He actually needs to play it down and bring attention to the rest of the tree because the deadwood is so highly sculptural. And with his pines, you can take your finger and stick it in between the plates of bark and not touch the trunk. You don't need to accentuate bark that thick. So you actually need to kind of play down the bark a little bit and bring the tree together as a whole by playing up the crown. So you add the complementary red color pot, which then complements your crown. This level of thought, I think, isn't tradition, which I think is a misstatement I hear quite often. Canton ware, pots from Guangdong in China. Again, this clay is so bad. It's humble. So Cantonese pots are made by, the region is located on a river, and the general source of the clay is river clay. So river clay's got a lot of sand in it. Sand is when fired to any reasonably high temperature, turns to glass. So you can't fire these pots very high. The walls have to be extraordinarily thick to be able to withstand slumping in the kiln because, glass melts. They're just very rustic, very humble, which is good. This humble rusticity gave us these glazes that we wouldn't have otherwise. They would still want to make beautiful containers, and the clay they have is garbage. So they came up with beautiful glazes that sort of imitate the glazes from their original homeland, which incidentally was in the middle northern part of China originally. This is on the lower east coast. But they were driven out, the original settlers in this region, by Genghis Khan, and originally settled here, and they're trying to imitate their original Juneware glazes. Never quite approached the beauty of those containers or those glazes, but they did the best with what they had. And what it gave us was something that's not only artistically unique, but horticulturally unique. This is important to note, because earlier we saw a Satsuki in that Nakawatari slide of Kokufu that was in a ruri glazed Cantonese container. Now we tend to think that this darker blue indigo color matches with Satsuki because it contrasts with the leaves, it plays well with the flowers. The thick walls are good for Satsuki roots. That's why they started being planted in Cantonese containers. This was a surprise to me when Mr. Kobayashi told me this. It's purely horticultural. So these antique Cantonese containers are deeper than other containers from the period, from other regions. They have thicker walls, so the roots are going to stay a little bit cooler. These are all things that Satsuki like, and they're much larger front to back than other antique containers. So these big Satsuki Nabari that are common features can be accommodated. So all of these things that were bad, river clay, sand, slumping pots, thick walls, humble, artistic designs, all of these add up to something that's horticulturally perfect for a few certain species that we now think of as traditional with these particular colors because of their horticultural needs. So these are, as I mentioned, these are closer in proportion to contemporary containers. It's important to note this because in all of the other regions that we're going to talk about, antique Chinese pots are really, really narrow front to back, and it's really hard to plant popularly designed trees in antique containers, just because Nabari are 360 degrees, and when you have a pot that's 2 to 1 on average, generally, it's really hard to accommodate a lot of our more modern, masculine bonsai styles. And again, due to the humble nature of this clay, you guys don't have to worry about this again. These are not very high fired, so they are not frost proof or frost resistant or frost anything. They just keep them away from frost. In fact, you'll mostly see them damaged or cracked because they're not frost resistant anyway. So this is a slide intended for multiple different things, mostly to show off my cat. Now, the cat has them on purpose. This cat is huge. It's not like Maine Coon level huge, but he's chunky. It's my fault. I feed him salmon. He's a hefty cat. He's very, very large. So you can kind of see in this Cantonese container the depth and the width front to back is more like what we look at today. That's a 250-year-old antique Chinese Cantonese container. Now, the other 5 containers here, they're intended to show one thing, and it's that I suck at appraising age. Not really, only a little bit. Only when it comes to Cantonese containers. When you look at these 5 containers here, the non-cat containers, if you try to pick which one is the oldest, any guesses? So the 5 containers, the 3 on the left, 2 top right, any guesses?
The one in the middle on the left.
Yeah, it is the one in the middle on the left. And it looks brand spanking new because it was never used. When I picked that pot up at Kokein, at Mr. Kobayashi's nursery, it had a price tag of like $15,000 on it. I was like, woo! Because I thought it was just a new Chinese pot. It was just kind of chilling out on the benches. It's important to note this because it's almost impossible for anyone that's not an expert to gauge the age of certain Cantonese containers because in all actuality, they've been using the same molds in some of the families for literally generations. There are some examples that you can't tell the age of a container but by the level of definition on the relief carvings on the outside, because as the mold's used over years and years and years and years and years, it loses definition. So as the pots themselves lose a little bit of definition, you can tell that they're newer than the older examples that are a little bit crisper. And this one, everything about it said brand new until I saw the price tag. So when you're looking at Cantonese containers, be very, very skeptical of any claims about age. And it's always a good idea to buy from respectable people, period, to know what you're looking at. But with these in particular, it's a good idea to seek an appraisal before you buy.
How big is that container?
Well, that's my hand.
That's what I thought, but I couldn't quite tell.
Don't ever do that either, by the way. You'll see multiple slides in this where I'm holding pots with one hand. I always ask permission to do this and take a picture. It's very rude to hold anything of any cultural value or monetary value with one hand. And, you know, this would be treating it with disrespect. I've asked permission in every case to do this. So, yeah, you're going to see me disrespecting a lot of things here. Some in ways that made me very nervous. We'll see in the Japanese portion. Koshinware is going to be a regional type of pottery that's glazed. And it's the same region as Nanbanware. So we're talking about Southeast Asia and Southern China here. And again, just like Cantonese pottery, the clay sucks. It's just very, very bad river clay. It's kind of sandy. You can kind of feel it. It's very, very coarse. It's not pretty. It's kind of an off-white, muddy, kind of tan. It's not very attractive in any way. But it is very lightly colored. And that allowed people in Southeast Asia and Southern China to make these really, really refined, lightly colored white, cream, and green glazes that are just unbelievably desirable today for A, because they match with different deciduous bonsai very, very well, and B, because they show patina better than anything else. You know, patina we'll talk about towards the end of the lecture. It's very important in what we do as bonsai artists, and nothing shows patina better than a cream glazed Koshinware container. Nanbanware, here we have 4 examples of that round Nanban shape, Southern Barbarian containers. You can see that rustic clay throughout all of those containers. These are all different ages. Here at the top left, this one actually looks kind of old, but it's fairly new. It was drilled out in the middle part of the 1950s up to the early 1960s. And then the top right is an Akawatari container. So it's going to be an antique of 100 to 200 years old. He refers to as frog snot is this stripe of glaze that only exists on wabi-sabi containers. And there are actually a lot of really, really good theories as to why this glaze exists. But none of them have to do with aesthetics, because these were originally either feeding dishes for livestock or pets, or the ones that are round and have a rim around the top. These would go in the top of a jar, and you could fill it with rocks or whatever to hold it down. These were jar lids. So these are, you know, livestock feeding dishes and jar lids. Nobody's trying to make these pretty. Nobody's going to make a new one if it gets a crack either. But you do have access to the local kiln and some ugly green glaze. Bam, good as new, frog snot. That's my theory anyway, is that these were originally repairs to items that there's no sense in making a new one just because you have a minor crack, but still managing to keep the integrity of the pot. But again, these were not intended to be bonsai containers in any way, shape, or form. They work so well with non-traditional wabi-sabi bunjin trees because they weren't intended to be bonsai containers. They were never intended to be aesthetic. They were intended to be functional. Some trees in non-bond wear. Here we have at the bottom left and bottom right 2 traditional bunjin trees, literati style trees. And at the top right we have that as a spruce, which I want to show again because I love that tree. I love that pot. If you've ever been to Brussels Nursery in Mississippi, in his foyer, his meeting room there at the front where he sells tools, there are 2 rectangle non-bond containers that are Kowatari, that are they're bathtub sized. They're huge. Absolutely gorgeous. If you're ever there and you get a chance to take a look at them, you won't see those anywhere else in the U.S. outside of Matt's house. Kinyo containers are probably the only example that we can talk about where the local populace made something not because of what they had, but because of what they could. So Kinyo containers and this very, very light blue glaze that works so well with our Japanese maples and trident maples, it has nothing to do with the region or their local materials. It's just for 200 years in China, they were the only people that could make this particular color and really, really bright yellows on non-porcelain, non-painted pots. And as a result of that, the kin kilns became synonymous with this light blue color, which is now just called kinyo, which means kin glaze. And this kin color, this very, very light blue, is a color in its own right. So this was originally the Yuzhou kilns in Heian province in China. So a little bit to the north of all these other places we've talked about so far. Here we have the top left an example of those bright yellow glazed kinyo containers that I mentioned. At the top right, we have a Namako kinyo container. A little bit rare to see. Most Namako containers came from Yixing. And we have 3 examples of traditional light blue kinyo. The one at the bottom left, I think it's cool to note, the interior has been entirely stripped of glaze. This wasn't intended to be a bonsai pot. And in fact, any very shallow, deciduous type pot made before 1900, the vast majority were not intended to be bonsai containers. They were originally suban. These were water basins without holes, and the glaze was removed inside. Holes were drilled later, and I would say a solid 30 or 40% of the glazed bonsai containers you see in the Kokufu 10 and Taikon 10 were former suban.
Why remove the glaze from the interior?
Good question. Now, there are a lot of theories, and most of them are silly. I think that the most convincing answer that I've heard, and the one that I support, is that, well, glazes are deadly. I mean, food safe is a relatively new conjunction of words. Like, things that aren't food safe are pretty much everything that was fired before 1900 in China. So the ingredients that go into glazes like this, so the principal ingredient in blue and green glazes and red glazes is copper, which is poisonous to plants, just like it's poisonous to fungus. It can kill trees. It can leach. So if you have a moderately fired glaze and it's leaching copper or lead or arsenic or cadmium or mercury or titanium, there's a lot. There's a lot that goes into these glazes. So if you have a non-food safe glaze that's in contact with water consistently and acid from our fertilizer consistently, it's going to leach into the soil and it's going to damage the trees. And I think it became tradition to remove the glaze because of negative health effects. I don't think the whole gripping the sides of the pot, this doesn't logically stick with me. And the breathability argument, and that doesn't make any sense to me either. So I think this idea of poisonous chemicals killing trees is the most solid answer for why the glaze gets removed and why we don't glaze on the inside per tradition. Good question. All right, break. I know I'm boring you, but we're going to talk about Japan next. And while I'm doing that, we take a little bit of break. I can go through some pots, or you can throw tomatoes or something, or you ask questions. You want to hit the lights and go through some pots? Feel free. Use the restroom.
Yeah, take a break. And
1800s, they was absolutely adored by the French Impressionist painters. So all of these containers from around the Seito era, Amari pots, Owari pots, all of these painted containers came from Japan for a very specific reason, and it's not very nice. They're basically Korean techniques applied to Japanese pots. So there were entire villages relocated to Seito in the 1600s and 1700s from Korea to Japan, and they settled in the Seto region, and they taught a lot of the painting skills that had been around in Korea for generations and generations and generations. And the Japanese took those techniques from these immigrants and turned them into this huge, massive porcelain-producing empire. For the Owari ware containers, the floating white egret ground orchid is native to the region. So you see a lot of these orchid pots with these floating white egrets on the outside. We would say cascade pot, but they're originally intended to be orchid containers. So these habanero radiata orchids are native to the region. You see those pretty frequently. I just wanted to point that out to someone who had this container over here, which is an old example of a Seito container, which is more specifically Owari ware. Very, 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 very common motif. But the patina is, patina builds very, very, very slowly on porcelain because it's very, very smooth. It's very, very, very non-porous. So the schmutz doesn't stick to it. It just kind of runs off. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Why patina is so important and how to build it. So yeah, I'm just skipping a little bit of the Japanese stuff because I kind of ran long on time. I just want to talk about a few potters of note that are important to consider when we talk about bonsai pots. Just kind of potters that everybody should be familiar with. They're the big three of the Japanese potters. Heian Tofukuji is considered the quintessential Japanese potter of things with holes in the bottom. He is considered the end-all, be-all of bonsai pot artists. He was born in Mizuno, Kisaburo in 1890 and lived until 1970. He was originally a comb maker, so as in like the type of combs that you would use to put your hair up in a bun, something like that. And he was fired from his job around 1911 or 1912. Bonsai was a hobby that he had when he was away from this comb making job that had been in his family for generations. When he lost his job, he decided to become a professional bonsai potter, which is absolutely insane because it's not a definable career path now, much less in 1911, 1912. This isn't something that you can really make a career out of or money out of. It's just kind of insane. So his family disowned him, and he kind of went into poverty. Did not live a very opulent life. Very, very poor. In fact, he just really had a tough life. But with that tough life, he made what are considered to be the best examples ever made of Oribe glazed pots, Cantonese glazed pots, Takatori glazed pots, which is a region in Japan famous for these red drippy glazes, and original glazes. He's considered to have made the best examples of all of these. And we're talking about 40, 50, 60 generations of potters that have been working with these glazes in both Japan and China. And one poor guy, made the best examples in one lifetime without a kiln, which is really, really, really hard to do because you really need that to, fire pots. So basically, the fact that he was so abjectly poor, and just had no access to any kind of monetary wealth or any kind of materials. Means that he had to scrimp on materials. He had to repurpose broken containers to use as grog in his clay bodies. It's reported grog is a real thing. I'm not just making words up. Not in this example. In other examples, yes, but not in this one. It's said that he used repurposed old Chinese pots that had broken as the grog in some of his unglazed pots. Whether or not that's true, I don't know, but it's a cool story, so I'm going to stick with it.
What's a grog?
Grog is chunks of stuff. It can be rocks, it can be vermiculite, it can be perlite. It's just basically something that is added to the clay body itself that helps prevent it from slumping or not from not keeping its shape in the kiln. Basically, it helps
Filler.
Yeah, filler, but it does serve a real function in allowing you to fire to certain temperatures. But for tofukuji, it's probably mostly filler, given the lack of loot. So in addition to firing in the local public kiln, which I mentioned earlier is an actual thing, he fired in his friend's kilns. And this is really important because he really defined where bonsai pottery would go, because he made almost exclusively tiny pots out of necessity. Because A, he was poor, he was just dead broke, can't afford a lot of clay, can't make big pots. And B, because he's firing in his friend's kiln in the local public kiln, which means he's not able to choose the location the pots are going to go in the kiln near the fire. So he has no control over firing temps. He's firing in his friend's kiln, which means spaces that are premium, if he even gets any decent amount of space. So as a result of this, he made almost exclusively small containers. And this focus on small containers kind of helped to direct the general aesthetics of shogi bonsai containers throughout the 20th century. He started something with his small pots that is still carried on today by many potters. There are at least a dozen potters in Tokoname and in other areas of Japan that have built an entire career just on being able to duplicate one tofukuji glaze. Just one. And he's a master of dozens. So at the top left, we have an Oribe glaze. This is a green glaze that contains copper. If it's fired in a certain way with oxygen in the kiln, it's going to turn green. If it's fired in a different way, non-oxygenated environment, it'll turn red. This has gold in it. I don't even know how it's possible. Like, shouldn't chemically be possible for this to have this gold around the rim that it has. Nobody knows how. Nobody can duplicate it. It was probably an accident on his part. It could have been flashing from another pot that was in there next to it. Could have been a dozen different examples of what happened, but it's unduplicatable. And because he really had no control over how his stuff was fired or where it was fired or at what temp, it created some one-off magical things that just can't be created in any other way than accidents. If you look at these other three examples, here at the top right, we have a really refined container. It's varnished on the outside, really technically very, very proficient, very precise, just solid craftsmanship. Bottom left, diametric opposite. This is a matte glazed red container, but it's so rustic that when I asked a Japanese professional friend, I was looking for a container for a friend of mine's black pine. This was the container he suggested. This container is so rustic that it was the first thing he thought of when trying to pair it with a conifer despite being glazed. So it's just the diametric opposite of its top right. He was skilled at absolutely everything he laid hands on. Here at the bottom right, we have this blue glaze container. It's a Ruri glaze streak container, and you have this little streak of black on the left. We don't know if it was an accident or intentional. It's not something he did a lot of, but you'll see it in a dozen different potters' work still today. Different potters in Tokoname have their own little stripes of glaze that they put as their little signature accent pieces. And it all traces back to this one pot and that one little black streak. So it's really difficult to overestimate the influence that Tofukuji has had on bonsai history and Shoin bonsai pottery history in particular. And here's that example I said earlier of me being extremely disrespectful and holding stuff with one hand. This is like the most nerve-wracking day of my life here. I have a really close friend, James Bailey, who has welders-related Parkinson's. Yeah, he ended up buying like half of the Tofukuji pots that we looked at that day. They brought out a cardboard box with like 200 of them in there. It wrapped in newspaper. But yeah, it was a very stressful day with James going through everything. And that pot at the bottom left is one of maybe 2 5-color Tofukuji pots. Not painted by Tofukuji, but the pot was made by him. It's a $15,000 pot. It's in the U.S. now too.
Decade on what one of his pots sold for.
That would have been 30,000. That would have been 30,000. So that was 15,000 8 years ago. Would have been 30,000 pre-1997. That pot at the top right, it has a twin. This pot. So they were made at the same time, and they're both blue glazes, but I don't even know how this one exists. It's got these 3-dimensional lumps on it. I don't know what they are. I don't know how he got it out of this blue glaze. It's probably, in person, the most detailed and topographical glaze I've ever seen. It's just absolutely one of the most beautiful things I've ever held. This one on the right, top right, it's a bad picture with the projector, but it's pretty close in person when you look at the glaze. It was 50,000 in 1994. The owner is delusional. It still hasn't come down to 10 grand. So when I mentioned multiple times that you can track the history of bonsai alongside the economy, and it's really true. So in 1997, the Japanese economy crashed, and it's never recovered. They've been in a recession for literally 32 years. So that's when the bonsai market just fell out. So from like the 1960s, 1970s up until 1997, you had growth, just solid growth. Sky's the limit. Prices were insane. And then the bottom fell out in 1997. It's never recovered since. So in 1994, 1995, that was a $50,000 pot. Should be about 20 now. But he's trying to get 40, and he still hasn't. Hank Kozan is the second of the big 3 that we'll talk about. I don't really want to talk about him a whole lot because he's not my favorite. He's known as the diametric opposite of Tofukuji. So with Tofukuji, we talk about warmth and originality and these really crazy complex glazes that can't be duplicated. You know, these are very Western ideas, originality and not copying, things like that. You know, Kozan is just good. He's just technically perfect in almost every way. His pots, you'll never find flaws. You'll never find things that are just really outlandish or ostentatious. They're just very, very shibui, very, very easily usable, very, they're sitting in tradition as far as old glazes, old styles, things that have been run through many times before, just done very, very well. And a lot of times that ends up being overly astringent for me, like this painting at the bottom right. It lacks a little bit of warmth to me. And that's not to say that he's not one of the greatest potters that ever is. It's just a personal taste thing. The astringency is not something I like. He's still obviously amazing. It's just, you know, not my favorite guy. Just absolutely everything he made was pretty much technically perfect. Here at the top right, we have a buckwheat glaze, very common glaze, cinnabar in the middle left. And what he's most famous for are these basket weave pots that are very, very highly detailed.
Question?
Yeah.
How do they change their names?
You know, I would say more than anything, it's because it's tradition. But there are multiple different reasons why, actually. So the vast majority of people, when they do change their name, they're trying to give a shout out to either their teacher which is something that happens in all Japanese crafts. So like if you're a sushi apprentice, right? You study with your sushi master. And then when you graduate 6 years later, you can go off and open a sushi restaurant with the same name as your master plus, your name. So it's considered like a franchise of the original kind of deal. So you'll have a lot of potters that are naming themselves in homage of their actual teachers, and then a lot of other potters naming themselves in homage of their region, like Baikoen Bonsai and Baikoen Hosui, both from Baikoen. Seito Bonsai from Seito. I think for the most part, it was originally a matter of protecting the artists when they were selling from multiple different houses. So you see this a lot with, the Japanese will have these big conglomerates that sell multiple different works from multiple different artists, all at different prices, without labeling who the artist is. And this is true not just for bonsai pots, but also for like knives, different other handicrafts. And so the artist's name are all protected, and they're given a new alias with each company they join up with, so that nobody ever says, okay, well, I just bought this Tanaka for $400 from Hatsukoro. Why is it $700 over here from you guys? It's a comparable thing. So originally it was a way to protect the artists, and then it became just something that you do. So, Stukenauer Yusen, we talked about technical precision, warmth and originality, and Stukenauer Yusen, we talk about painting. Stukenauer Yusen is considered the quintessential painter of stuff with holes in the bottom. Unlike Tofukuji, who was a cone maker, he was trained in a traditional Kiyomitsu ware pottery house. So Kiyomitsu ware, stuff in Kyoto, very, very long history of production painted pots and porcelain. So he trained making traditional household wares in Kyoto. And then he was severely injured in World War II, lived in pain throughout his entire rest of his life. Severe hand and arm pain. And he started painting pots just as a way to distract himself from his pain, both emotional and physical, after the war. And pretty much just made them for personal use to plant and give away to friends. They're like nothing else that's ever been painted. Even today, it's been 50 or 60 years. But see, here at the top left, the pot on the bottom, this blue container. Lots of painters are technically proficient. Lots of guys have great line detail. You can make a really great landscape painting. But this isn't just a landscape painting. You have a lone figure on the prow looking up at the moon. There's a sense of loneliness here. Like, there's actual emotion. Like, there's a story being told, and this is 3 inches. Like, to be able to tell a story and evoke an emotion from somebody as hard-hearted as myself in a 3-inch space is really not easy to do. And nobody's been able to duplicate it since. Many have tried, but it's not happening. Yeah. Heard. So many have tried, but no one has ever been able to duplicate the sense of emotion that Yusen put into his works and things like that. Not probably also one of the most technically proficient painters, but definitely the painter who tells the best story of all bonsai potters. So this is the one thing out of everything you take away from me today. You're going to forget 90% of what I said because this is in a foreign language and I don't pronounce the word very well. And I don't even know what I'm talking about half the time. I'm kidding. But if you take anything away, tokoname is not a synonym for quality. In fact, used as a sole descriptor, it's virtually meaningless. It's like saying something is from Ohio. What does that mean? Okay, I've got a bonsai pot here. It's from Ohio. Is it Dale Koshoy? Is it Brad? Who made it? Ohio doesn't tell you anything. It's just a place. It doesn't tell you anything about the pot or the artist. And that's what saying something in tokoname is. It's totally meaningless. They're great potters in tokoname. They're also absolutely garbage potters in tokoname. If you go and ask the average guy on the street, hey, what is tokoname famous for when it comes to pottery? The average guy on the street is going to tell you toilet seats and ceiling tiles, because that's what they make. They make all the toilets and all of the roof tiles in Japan. And, you know, that's what they're most known for. When it comes to traditional pottery, they're most known for these painted wares from the antique period. And this whole bonsai thing is a really, really new thing. And really only became associated with quality with us here in the West because of a catalog. It really doesn't have any bearing on the wealth of pottery that exists throughout Japan, and it's really just a result of the catalog. It doesn't mean that, you know, there aren't great potters in Tokonami. Some of the best potters that have ever lived come from Tokonami. But there's also crap in there too, and toilets. So, if all you know about a container from a seller is that it's Tokonami, I would advise you to move along. Because Tokonami, as a descriptor, does not in any way define quality or value. Only artist does. And patina. This is my favorite thing to talk about because it's so misunderstood. The first time I gave this lecture, a very famous potter critiqued me and said that patina is dirt, cracks, and chips. And yeah, well, it's not. It's definitely not that. Well, what it is dirt. Yes, in a certain sense. So patina is microscopic particles of fertilizer, dirt, ambient dust, anything, just schmutz, stuff in the atmosphere, solid fertilizer, stuff in your water. All of this stuff, microscopic particles of it, building up over time. Large particles will slough off, small particles will stick. You can speed this up in ways that we'll talk about in a minute, but the actual film itself is coffee colored and just creates a very simple darkening. All it is visual aid. It's visual age. So why is visual age important? What we do with bonsai is to create the image of an aged tree in miniature that evokes or invokes emotion. And, you know, we get that much closer to an aged tree if we have an aged tree. That's why we like Yamadori, right? It's because they have actual age. That actual age gets us 90% of the way to the goal because we're trying to create the image of an aged tree. Well, pots with patina are just the Yamadori of containers. All we have with patina is just visual age. It's just makes a container that looks like the tree has been in that container for its whole life. And when a tree is perfectly matched to a container, even though you just repotted it, it should look like they were never separate. They should match in both age and, most importantly, as someone told me in Japan, in dignity. And then you created the perfect match. You're less concerned with the dignity of the pot, which encompasses age, value, quality, artist, than color or shape or size. The dignity of the pot. And that begins with patina. So how do we build patina on our pots? I've heard like a dozen different theories about this, and most of them are pretty much wrong. Mostly I heard that patina builds faster in Japan than it does in the United States because of the water supply, of how they fertilize, which that's part of it, but not really. Mostly it's because of apprentices. In Japan, you know, you have trees out on the benches in pots, and you have apprentices. And when you have customers coming by that you're trying to sell, you know, stuff to, you send the apprentices out there to wash the pots and oil them and dry them. And they're stored outdoors because that's where you're selling your stuff. So just the simple act of washing your containers with soap and water before you go and water, once every fortnight, and then hitting them with a light coat of oil. It does not matter what oil. Peter Krebs gets all wadded up about using like high density motor oil. Too far. You know, there is something to be said about different viscosity levels, but it doesn't really matter. Sometimes I use walnut oil. Sometimes I'll go out there with a can of Pam after I'm done. It doesn't matter. All that matters is you have a thin film of oil that traps microscopic particles while sloughing off large particles. Win-win. It's sloughing off large particles of dirt and salt. and leaving microscopic particles of patina, which is money. You have two identical pots, and the only difference between them is one has patina and the other doesn't. The one with patina will always be worth more. Patina adds value, and so this is a win-win-win, really, actually, because you're going to notice stuff going on at the soil level when you're out there oiling your pots and then washing them, then oiling them. You're going to notice stuff that you don't normally see, health issues and things faster. So this is a win-win-win to do things this way, and it's how to build patina much faster than is typically
So
quoted.
2 decades instead of 3.
Well, I would say 10 years. So we actually tested this. And the test is still ongoing. You can get a very solid, like I would say 2/3 of the way to 60 years. This I look at this and I see 60 to 80 years, just because of how porcelain patinas. The fact that it's even from top to bottom means it's never been cleaned. Just the way porcelain patinas, how it builds patina, how it hasn't been cleaned on the top. This is 60 to 80 years. You can cut that down to 15 by doing this type of regimen. I don't really see any drawback to it at all. I actually really have noticed health issues with my trees faster at the soil level by doing this. So I think there's no negative effects and nothing but positives.
Did you say you made with soap and water?
Yes. So what I do, I have a bunch of trees. I take a bucket and a soft bristled nylon brush. I put a couple drops of dish soap in some very, very, very mildly warm water, like just slightly above room temp, and I just walk around to all of my trees, hit once, and then move along, and then I come back and I water, and then I will either go around and then wipe them down with a pot that has, with a rag that has oil on them, or I'll wait for them to dry and then do that later or the next day. Just a little bit of oil, just a very light film. You'll never get lime scale again.
How do you get the lime scale off without taking the patina off?
Here's the fun part, you don't. Okay, so now there are ways to do this. They are really, really, really not fun. So the only way that I've found that works very well takes about a year. And I don't even know if it will work here. So if your water is still hard and you're watering with that water, it won't work here. But if you're not watering with hard water still, you can bury the pot just under your benches, wherever you're watering. And over a year, the soil will leach that salt off. It takes a while, but it will take all of it off and it will leave all the patina intact. That is the only way I have found to leave all of the patina intact and remove serious limescale. If it's
fully buried, like
fully buried all the way, because the dirt is actually leaching the salt off of the outside of the pot very, very slowly. That's the only way that I have found to do it where it works and leaves all of the patina. Now, if you just have very mild limescale, don't do anything. In Japan, they don't even bother removing it if it's very mild. If you oil the pot for show, limescale disappears for 2 weeks. So if it's mild, I wouldn't bother removing it. Obviously, it's easier to prevent it by oiling your pot fortnightly. But if you have it already, oil the pot for show. Don't worry about removing it if the pot is valuable and has patina.
how long is a fortnight?
20 days.
When you bury it, do you?
I could say every 3 weeks, but I like saying fortnight better.
When you bury it, should be dry soil or under where it's going to?
I've never actually tried and see if there's a difference. So I can't honestly answer that. I have only done it underneath my benches. I've done it underneath my benches, and I know other places that it's been done under people's benches. I do not know if it takes longer or anything, if you're burying it somewhere where you're not watering with non-hard water regularly. But I would imagine it probably would take longer.
At
Question?
my house, there's no such thing as dry soil because he lives in Mississippi.
Yeah, that's true. We don't have dirt, we have clay. So how do I identify bonsai pots? This is how. Take a picture of this and just email me. That's it. Woohoo! It's really easy. So yeah, just by being here, you guys are entitled to multiple free handfuls of appraisals. Just feel free to shoot me an email. Just send me a message. You can contact me on Messenger. It's much faster than email. Super bad about email. But I will get to those eventually. And then you'll have my website there, which has the largest database in any language of bonsai-specific artists' marks. And there you go. Email address, Facebook handle, and a pretty little tree. I have more stuff, but I haven't actually given this lecture in a minute. I tend to ramble when I haven't talked about something in a while because there's new stuff I have learned since the last time I gave the lecture. They're different every time.
You got time?
Awesome. Lock the door. So, what would you like me to talk about the pots? I'm going to go through everybody's stuff here and write everything down. So somebody asked earlier how I got started doing this. So I spent some money on something. It was expensive, and I couldn't find any information. And I was like, this is crazy. Basically, I bought a pot.
Hey, Greg, you want to start the raffle while he's talking? Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So basically, I bought a pot, and it was $200. At the time, for me, I had been doing bonsai for 2 years, and I had a bunch of sticks. $200 for a 4-inch pot was a lot of money. This was an investment outlay. Now it's maybe not so much, but then I was like, wow, that's a lot of money. This was the second pot that Matthew Owinga sold to anybody. So Matthew Owinga is probably the largest seller of bonsai containers of quality in the world. Maybe some competition from a couple sellers in Japan, but not really. He sells more pots than anybody, more stuff of quality than anybody in the West for certain. But this was the second pot that he ever sold. And this pot was obviously high quality. It was gorgeous. I mean, just everything about it screamed, this is better than anything I've seen before. But nobody could tell me why it was worth $200, why I paid $200, why I thought it was worth $200, who made it, when it was made, where in Japan it was from. Absolutely nothing. Zero information from anybody. Any seller on eBay or in the United States. Nobody could tell me anything. And I thought about it, and I just decided that was absolutely insane. That means that we, as a community, have been spending hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars every single year on something that we don't really understand. And to me, being kind of a greedy little guy, I was like, I think I can fix this. And, maybe learn something in the process. And I set out to do that. And originally, the goal was just to kind of get rid of the scammers on eBay. And then it became something else. That's how I got started. Still have the pot, too. Sold a lot of other stuff, but I won't sell that. So that's how I got started doing this. And I basically just looked at all this stuff for way too long. And now I can read most of the marks. So, for example, this, I wouldn't even need to look at this mark to tell you that this is Suisho and Hekasui from Tokoname. They were very popular in the 1960s and 1970s, but they went all the way through the 80s and early 90s. This green color clay, very, very unique to this kiln. So this is Mitsukami Shinji. Yeah, this green color, I didn't even need to see the stamp, but it is, in fact. So, it's Subon. With the lightning pattern, is going to be probably mid-80s. Very unique green color. Some people collect them just for that green color. This, production Tokoname, Kayu, no.
Yeah.
Yamako. This particular glaze, these black flecks on top of this kind of a grayish body. Originally, the founder of the Yamaki kiln developed this style. And he used to take partially cooked rice, white rice, not husk rice, and he would rub it on the outside of his containers before they went in for firing. And it would burn off and create these really, really small, tiny dots of carbon on the outside, these little black flecks. And it became very, very popular to the point where you have production kilns like Yamako making them in the 80s. Here we have 11. So numbers on the bottom of bonsai containers are never good. There are only two things they can be. They're either sizes or they're page numbers. In either case, they're not good. In this particular example, it's a size. It's a number 11. So this sizes vaguely correspond to inches, but that's not what they represent. It's a whole different other thing. That is an archaic system of Japanese measurement that's very, very close to inches. So this 11 is going to be a good approximation of inches. But it's a size marking.
Star.
This is Izumiya.
Darren.
So the Izumiya kiln, sometimes called Zenigo, but that's actually a misnomer. You might have even heard me say Zenigo, because I've actually said that improperly in the past. There's a famous antique Chinese kiln from the Nakwatari period that uses many of the same kanji in their chop that Izumiya uses in his hanko. And so he got the nickname Zenigo, but they're unrelated. This is mid-80s Tokoname Izumiya. His wife also makes very beautiful rustic little tiny non-blind containers. This general style of dragon and stuff he's very well known for, but lots of Tokoname potters are. So here's that same kind of glaze that I was talking about. It was originally the rice. Bill Valavanus actually has one of the original rice versions of that Yamaki container these are duplicates of.
Star.
And we don't have a stamp here, but it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be Yamako or one of the other production kilns like Keio from Tokoname, late 70s up to early 90s. Very, very, very prolific.
So Michael, that's a glaze, is that gray color?
You know, it's very tough to say what's a glaze, what's not a glaze, what's a matte finish. So for the Japanese, this is not a glaze. Most of the things that American potters refer to as matte glazes are not glazes. So for the Japanese, a glaze is glass, period. This is just this is just a finish. So you can have a pot like,
Squiggle.
let's see.
Darren. Black cat.
No, we don't really have any examples here. You can have a pot with a really, really matte glaze, something that's not shiny, and they're going to still enter that into the unglazed category for competition. You'll frequently see pots that American potters would call glazed, winning unglazed prizes in competition in Japan, which is, it's really fascinating. But for the Japanese, glaze is glass, period. This is just a finish. I tend to agree with them, but I'm stuck in my habits. This one I was not sure of who made it. Don't know. I thought maybe Jim Barrett, but I can't read the English on top of it. I'm going to have to look closer. This I don't need to look at close at all because I could tell from the finish that it's Deiju. Tokoname Mid-'80s, closed down. We're only in operation for like 15 years or so. You see this a lot in the United States because Russell went to the kiln in the mid-'80s when they were only open for a very short amount of time and brought a ton of these, along with an entire warehouse of Kowatari containers that he brought back to the U.S. So you actually see these around the U.S. more than you see them in Japan. But they're really cool and unique. And more towards what we like stylistically as far as like this kind of rustic, more wabi-sabi kind of finish and carving is what he's really known for. This is an important one to kind of point out because this is not painted. So you'll frequently hear people use the term transfer wear. The transfer it's a fancy name for glazed stickers. So these are basically printed out or painted on if they're really nice transfers in advance and then applied later and then fired on. So this is an example of a painted pot made in a production factory type of way. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with that. It's just not hand painted. And you can recognize the signs of this by repetition in different shapes. You'll see repetition in shapes, period, just because of the way Chinese and some production Japanese artists paint. They'll paint one particular item on say, 14 different pots at one time. So one hill gets painted on each pot, and then they come back and then do one tree on each pot. And so you'll have repetition in that sense, but not in the same way you will with transfer wear, where you'll see the same little pine branch repeated multiple times throughout the pot. This is a koreku pot. It's actually, koreku is not the potter. It's the name of a garden where multiple potters made pots under the name Koreku Inn. So we don't really know who made this. We just know that where it was sold and who it was made for. So you have varying degrees of quality for Koreku pots. It's a good price. Looks like Matt's handwriting. This is green, and a particular kind of green. Green clay is rare. It's the same. It's Suishiro Hekasue Mitsui Kame Shinji. Both of these are very nice, mid-tier, contemporary, and previous generation painters. So this is an Ishida Shozeki pot. So Ishida Shozeki is very, very important in the history of bonsai containers because she's the first female to really break the glass ceiling, to really be respected for her work in its excellence, and not because who she knew or what competition she won, just because it's good. Her stuff is very, very unique. It has a decidedly warm and feminine air to it. You'll see often children and family scenes portrayed that you're not going to see from masculine painters. But her style is very unique, immediately recognizable, and she was a real trailblazer for the feminist movement for potters. Her daughter-in-law now runs the painting business, and she has a booth at Kokofu every year. She married her son, and he just kind of runs the business. He's not very artistic. This is Tani Ranzan. So Tani Ranzan was a sushi chef after my own heart. I have a kind of a great love for the three painters that were sushi chefs. Tani Ranzan, Fujikake Yuzan, and Ito Gecko were all sushi chefs. But Tani Ranzan actually passed away 2 years ago. He was mediocre sushi chef, but a pretty good painter and a pretty good carver of bonsai containers. And he originally started cranking out his pots just as decoration for his sushi restaurant. So did Fujikake Yuzan. He also started painting containers just to decorate the shelves in the sushi restaurant. And one day, Keiji Miyata came in and was like, "These are amazing. You need to enter a contest." And he's like, "Bah." And then he entered the contest and he won. And he became the most easily the top 1 or 2 best painter of his generation. It's Yuzan and Gecko for the previous generation are the best painters from Japan. This was that unglazed clay container of vermilion clay. So this is Shude, this deep red, rich glaze. It's actually almost Kode. So the Japanese relationship with the color red is complicated and very deep. You know that whole mythological thing about Eskimo words for snow? Like, it's an awful thing, and like it's often repeated, but there really are like 1,000 different types of red that the Japanese look for. Like, you know, Sangukaku, the Japanese maple we have with the coral twigs, that coral color is highly prized for clay pots. But all of these different little gradations of red are highly sought after by pottery collectors. And this is actually approaching Kode, which is a brighter red than their vermilion Shude, and also very rare. But the patina that's the money part. That's visible age right there.
So that container was all red when it was.
This was all red. So this darkening here at the bottom,
the
building from the bottom, right, that way, that's patina, that's age.
Oh, okay.
So that's just patina. This has been cleaned at the top. They take a stainless steel brush and scrub too. It's not pretty to watch. But it's been cleaned very well. I mean, eventually, when a pot builds up enough patina, it's not a red pot anymore. I mean, when you have a pot and when we talk about patina, you still want to use a red pot. Like, you know, if you have a shippaku, you want to highlight the deadwood. You still want to use a red pot. You don't want to use something that's completely covered by this coffee brown color. You still want that red to bring out and contrast with the white deadwood. So once it becomes no longer red anymore and it's just this coffee brown color, then it has to be cleaned. You clean the center to kind of expose some of this red color. Or you clean the top and kind of make sure that this halfway mark patina building from the bottom is all seen. So you still want, with your patina being heavy, to have a red pot, just a really old looking red pot. This is shohachi. So this is bige. So bige, and this is a pretty cool ingo kind of thing we have going on. This wood effect we have here is ingo. But that doesn't matter to you guys. This is carved. And in such a way, and Bige is very famous for his carved pots and his unglazed bokashi shude, which is like a darkened fake patina vermilion red clay. Shohachi is also famous for this, but in my opinion, much better at it. Do you mind? Thank you. So, I mean, the color of the clay, this orangish red, very, very, very unique to shohachi. Also very, very rare. This is a natural clay too. So when I say that this is on the same level and the same skills that Bige has with his burnishing and use of very high quality clay and skills with carving, it's pretty easy to see why this is the same kind of deal, except on a much higher level.
What would you value that cost?
Right now, I would say between $250 and $375. Everything will be worth more very shortly. It's all gone. It's harder and harder and harder to find good quality stuff. You know, every month it gets harder and harder and harder. All of the antique stuff is moving back to China, and that's been going on for decades. But the higher quality Japanese stuff, a good deal of it has been purchased by collectors in Taiwan, purchased by collectors in Europe. Some stuff just never leaves odd collections. So let's talk about carved pots. There's a guy here in the United States that's obsessed with Zeshin pots. So Zeshin pots are just flat out weird. So, these are Zeshin pots. They are frankly unusable in any form of bonsai that we typically know. These are just really crazy things. But there's a lot of lessons. I mean, obviously the technical precision and skill taken to carve these is immense. You know, none of these are bigger than like 2.5, 3 inches. Yeah, the one in the top right, that's like a 2.5-inch pot. It's tiny. That much detail in that small of an area, and then you have all this stuff on the bottom too that's carved on the underside. Just all of this detail. It's just gorgeous. But my point here is not that he's awesome. He's an acquired taste, at minimum. Is that these markets are tiny. So there's one guy in the U.S. He likes really weird stuff, man. Really weird stuff. All he collects is weird stuff. And when I first started doing this and collecting pots that I bought from Japan, you could get a really nice session like this crab for like maybe 125 bucks. And now, by the time he got done collecting them, they're like $850. One collector. One collector changed the market for Zeshin pots by 8 times, 800%, minimum 800%. Some of them are $1,500 for pots that I would have paid $125 for 10 years ago. To be fair, he changed the entire market, and he doesn't have any dishes. Like, you go in his kitchen and like his cabinets, it's just stacks and stacks of Zeshin pots. There's no glassware in it. He's a weird dude. But still, he managed to change the entire market alone. Yeah.
So you're talking almost like supply and
I
demand.
think he bought Matt a house too. Like, yeah, he loves some weird stuff. Yeah, I do believe he's from here. I think he was one of Nathan's students, actually. Yeah, but he moved away. It was a while ago. But yeah, so the market for bonsai containers is very small, especially when you get into things like this. And there's never been a huge supply of some of the rarer stuff. I mean, some of the stuff that's really, really nice has been in demand for decades. And it's always been hard to find. And it's getting harder and harder and harder. I used to see 20 good tofu kuji for sale every month. And now I see 3. Prices are not reflecting that steep of a drop in availability yet. But they will, and it will not take very long at all that they do. I would say within the next 5 years, everything will triple in price.
Michael, what do you think of Kawada pots?
I think I bought them a kiln. Obviously, I like them.
Yeah.
I mean, I participated in the charity thing, the fundraising thing, where we all chipped in and bought him a kiln. I think he's great. He's doing fantastic work. And I think it's really, really cool that the community, like, he couldn't have done any of that stuff without so many people loving him and buying him that kiln. I think he's doing just incredible stuff. And he's such a nice guy. When I first started doing this, he made these, I forget what they're called. They're like garden spirit kind of things, kind of like frog ghosts kind of things. Gizo kappa. Yeah. So he made these really rustic Gizo kappa, and he didn't have a kiln to fire anything nicer. And just watching his growth has been incredible. He's winning awards left and right. I think he deserves it. For sure.
Who was that? Who are you talking about?
Kawada. Yuki Kawada. I had a whole slide in here about understanding price and value, but I don't know what happened to it. But needless to say, everything is going to increase in price very, very shortly.
How expensive are these pots?
Kawada?
Yeah.
I would say on average, whatever Dave wants to sell them for. I mean, it's the only place you can get them.
Yeah,
like,
right.
I think they're pretty variable and range from 300 to 600.
Yeah, that's right,
Yeah.
A lot of work.
So I didn't put prices on anybody's stuff over here, but if you would like prices, just come grab me and I'll tell you. I didn't want to like marking everybody's stuff for everybody to see.
6 million.
So, you know, these are actually appraisals in addition to identification. So please feel free to ask and any questions that you may have.
Yeah.
One of that?
Some more over here.
Oh, more. I'm going to say that this is accurate. It is a Chinese pot. Furniture. So this is going to be from either kiln furniture or squaring off. So when I talked about grog earlier, see these little flecks of stuff in here? These flecks are not surface. This is stuff inside the clay, little flecks of stuff, chunks of rock and, you know, various types of other clay, filler, vermiculite type stuff. This rustic kind of grog.
How old would you say that is?
$140 to $150. So I'm going to put this towards the middle to earlier side of Nakawatari because of the size of the drainage and how far they are off to the sides. So these larger drainage starts to get really smaller and smaller as you approach the turn of the century. So as you approach 1900, they start to get smaller and smaller up to a point. And the larger drainage holes are kind of limited to the middle and early parts. And then Kawatari containers will have like gigantic holes that were not intended to be drainage at all. But I'm going to say this is 140 to 150 Nakawatari and not non-bond, but pretty close. Probably southern China from the grade of the clay that's here. This kind of rustic clay that's got some grog kicking it. You know, you can just kind of feel the coarseness. The Japanese would say warmth. Like this kind of coarseness that's really natural. You can't really fake or duplicate that in any way.
And evaluation.
Cracks. So, you know, this is a bell. I'm a bell. This is a bell. Sorry. So, as a bell, if there's a crack anywhere, it won't ring. You can hear a tinny sound. So, right here where this chip is, right here, thuds just a little bit more than it does down here. That's just the chip. So when the integrity is flawed, you'll get a different sound. And you can find what are called water cracks, which usually you have to trace water and where it runs into the pot using that method and then following it with water. But this has no major cracks, a few small chips, near mint. One crack around the drainage hole. I would still say that this is near mint for the age. 1800 minimum. And I would say within 10 years it'll be worth double that because you can't find perfect condition Chinese pots anymore. Chinese collectors do not want anything damaged. So the only thing that we see coming out of Japan now for antique Chinese pots is broken and chipped stuff. All of the really, really nice, perfect stuff has repatriated. And so it's going to become rarer and rarer and rarer. And just the few minor interior chips on here are cosmetic and not an issue. And they're old enough to have their own patina. There are no bad repairs, and it rings like a bell. That is near mint for an antique. Very nice. This is handmade yamaki, and a really good example of shide. This is purple. So you see what I mean by brown, with notes of purple if you look real hard. If it's got a black pine in it and you're looking for shadows between the bark, then you can kind of see the purple. But it's brown. So this is handmade Yamaki by the 3rd generation proprietor of the Yamaki kiln. Yamaki kind of ruined the game for everybody. Just they really, really ramped up production in the 80s. And as a result, 90% of tokoname closed down by 1997. Crashed and burned. However, over the last 5 years, 3 new kilns have opened in tokoname. This is huge. It doesn't seem like much. That hasn't happened in 20 years.
And the name of those kilns?
That means that, you know, these people think they can make a living at it. It means that they want to do it. They're focusing on handmade stuff and high quality stuff, just like.
And the name of the kilns, those kilns?
There's Mufu.
Okay.
And his alternate name, which is his brother, who's a painter, and I don't remember what that is off the top of my head. And then there's Sensui, who makes mostly glazed stuff that you'll find. All 3 of those make very, very high quality stuff.
Very good.
This is Fukuho. Yeah. Really, really nice tokoname pot, mid-80s. Nice form. Nothing too special, but in good condition. Very, very, very highly respected potter. On par with handmade Yamaki, maybe a little bit higher. So a step down from Gyozan, step up from Yamaki. So I would say $325 retail.
What was the Yamaki about?
$275. I think those are a bit undervalued, but just because there's so many of them. They're actually really, really easily usable and really, really high quality, but they're just everywhere. This is Yushu Keishin Meruhei, which is just fun to say, hands down. So this is a really, really, really nice pot. This would be worth taking the salt off in a burying way. So this is some of the Meruhei kiln's more production stuff, but their stuff is really nice. So a very small step down from Gyozan. If you're a big Peter T fan, a big step up. So if you remember Peter T's blog when he was an apprentice, he had a thing for pots with huge lips that were peach colored. So the guy who ran this kiln at the time in the 1970s, the kiln's been around since the turn of the century, like the 1890s. He basically was digging in his yard and found this huge vein of peach-colored clay. So these pots that Peter is writing about, with these huge lips that are peach-colored, he found all this clay in his backyard, basically, in tokoname. And he dug it all up, used it all, and over like 4 or 5 years. And so those pots, that peach color will never be reproduced again, never has been seen before, never will be seen again. And it's this same artist. That's worth burying and cleaning up. Tosui, Yamaki, Shizan, Tosui, China Yixing, direct quote. So this one is, you have the stamp, it's a regional stamp. Basically, from 1967 to 1977, Chairman Mao made artists illegal. So it was illegal in certain professions to sign your work because it was seen as egotistical and Western. So some artists did, and those pots are very, very, very valuable because they're flying in the face of the communist regime and the Maoist doctrine. So the ones that are signed that were made in that period are very valuable. I collect those. But the stamp, the regional stamp itself dates them definitively as post-1967. And an artist stamp generally means it's post-1977. So what we have here is just a regional stamp that says where it was made. We don't know the artist. There are a few that are really unique with this regional stamp that you can tell and pinpoint to a particular artist. But to be honest, I'm not good enough to do that. And it's really, really rare to find one that is extraordinarily valuable. But the ones that are like small house level valuable. There used to be there was a
small house here.
Yeah, no, small house here valuable. So those 300 mame pots that I mentioned earlier that apprentice got smacked around for, those are worth $14,000 to $20,000 each now.
Wow.
The forbidden bean pots, of which there are only 300. Yeah, and those are the least valuable stuff from any of the 7 great masters. They're considered the best potters that ever came out of China. They were active in the middle part of the 20th century. There's only 300 bonsai containers. And they're way out of everybody else's ballpark. This is fun. So this is a negative stamp that says Choshun. And by negative stamp, I mean it's a mirror image of what the stamp is supposed to look like, which is super shady. Because it means somebody took a pot that was an antique Chinese pot and made a mold, including the stamp, and boom. So you make a mold of the stamp and then you can stamp other pots. And the Yamaki kiln actually got their start doing knockoffs. This is Yamaki. It's marked Choshun. If you look at the old books from Japan, you'll actually see that he claimed the Choshun stamp as his own, but it's a negative of the real antique Chinese Choshun stamp. But then he never claims it after those books written in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, after that, it's not talked about. Also Yamaki, production Yamaki. So this is a sign. When I mentioned earlier that this was a handmade Yamaki from the 3rd generation proprietor of the Yamaki kiln. So this would be a forgery by the 1st generation founder of the Yamaki kiln. And this would be a production pot by the 3rd generation proprietor of the Yamaki kiln. So this is 100 years of malfeasance and legitimate craftsmanship at the same time. I say malfeasance here, but I mean there's a different way of looking at art in Asia in general, and especially in Japan. So here in the West, we prize originality, creativity, right? Copying stuff. This is not cool, not done. In Japan, it's totally different. You know, to be a great artist, you copy the masters. If you are lucky and you really, really break your back, you might be able to branch out from the master's work. But until you're in your 60s or 70s, you keep copying the same thing. And, you know, you show your technical precision through, you know, homage and copy. It's not considered to be the same level of theft that we would consider it here. Creativity isn't as prized as technical precision. So there's a different priority of aesthetics that it's important to note. So it's not really malfeasance, but maybe a little. And I'll write all of these down. So these are both tosui. These are production grade tosui. This is the most recent tosui. So this is a Seito ware pottery family that goes back like 5 generations at this point. And the 5th generation, non-related but trained potter is Haruyoshi, who has a Facebook account. He writes and posts in English. But he's one of the greatest potters that's currently living. One of the greatest painters that's currently living. And if you do Facebook and social media, you should subscribe to Haruyoshi's stuff because it's always very, very interesting. And it's a really long tradition of history. He was the guy that told me once, when I was asking questions about patina and why it was so important, he said, I sent him a picture of some accent plants I planted in one of his painted pots. And I thought it was cool, but he really appreciated it. He said that he doesn't consider his pots finished until they've gone out into the world and artists have used them for at least 10 years. And then he can look at them, and they're done. So he's actually planning his pots to how they'll look with patina, how they'll look after they've left his hands. Like the actual work is done when he's not involved, which to me, very cool. That's a totally different way of looking at artistry, and that kind of blew my mind a little. This is another one of those pseudo rice pots. Ooh. It sounds Korean, but it's not. Korean pots all have a very unique kind of metal ring. Tongray pots. This actually might be. It's unmarked. Either Korean or production tokoname, one or the other, but a production pot for sure. In that same rice finish. This is also a handmade yamaki, but this is a really nice example of shude, a vermilion red. It's a very pretty color for the yamaki kiln, so I would actually tack on.
And that's that bag style pot.
Yes,
yeah.
This is a, yes.
Yeah.
So, so we say bag, the actual word is like purse.
Okay.
So it's like it's meant to look like a like an old school like drawstring coin purse.
Right.
Yeah, super usable. Very, 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 very much a pain in the butt to repot, but one of my favorites. The shape. This is Shuho, not Yoshimura Shuho, just Shuho, but it's the same guy. So Shuho is one of the few artists that you can actually pinpoint when his stuff was made by how he signed it. In 90% of all artists' cases, it means absolutely nothing, whether or not they signed it or stamped it, or signed and stamped it, or numbered and signed and stamped it, or drew on it, whatever. It doesn't matter. None of it matters. With most artists, it doesn't matter. But with Shuho, he changed his actual signature based on periods he felt in his career where his style was changing. So you can actually say, okay, this was made in post-1982 because he took the stamp that said Yoshimura off in 1982. And then he really started to delve into more handmade, more glazed stuff. So you can pinpoint exactly the date in the artist's career when this was made as a Shuho pot. For the most part, though, it doesn't mean anything with most artists. A friend of mine asked the potter Gyozan once, why do you have so many stamps? Why do you decide to change them? Because I felt like it. That was it. That was his answer. Because I felt like it. I change it when I feel like it, and that's the only reason. It has absolutely no bearing on anything else. Is there any that I missed?
Can I ask you this one? I just
Absolutely.
in the raffle. I don't know. I mean, we were looking.
That's a $3,000 car.
I hope so.
Do you know what? So you would keep all this? You wouldn't want to get rid of that for your.
If the pot's not particularly valuable and it doesn't have patina, then it's best to just go ahead.
Okay.
So,
You're hiding behind the pillar, Michael.
I for this pot? Okay. So this is actually a really good teaching tool. So this is a good production pot. It's thick, it rings, but you have inside of the container these ripples. You'll have to look close to see it. And on the bottom, you have what is not a stamp. Please don't send it to me. And it is called a nipple. So what this thing on the bottom, this little knob is where they have a mold, a slip mold. So slip is mud. It's basically just liquid clay. It's like, not a very good medium to make hard stuff out of it. It's just, you know, wet clay. So you're pouring that in a liquid form into a mold, through a tiny hole. And if they're not cleaning up that little nub that's left from where they're pouring it in, not a lot of thought's going into it. And these ripples are where different layers are pouring out. So it means that the pot was slip cast. I actually used to carry a pot similar to this for that reason. So I showed this. But yeah, it's a good example of that. Pot itself, though, is pretty glazed and a production container, but
But cleaning it, but you would take,
I would go to town with CLR and a copper brush. Oh yeah. So this one's super weird because all we have here are conjectures and theories that are grounded in fact. So this artist, we know, those of us in the community, that it's a student of the famous artist Bushuan, who's one of my favorite artists. If you've ever read my blog, you already know that. I don't need to repeat it because there's a whole bunch of articles in there where I'm just really fluffing the guy up. And so it's a student of Bushuan. We don't know why he only stamps outside of the clay. So this is a separate piece of clay that he's sticking on here and then stamping after he's made the pot in some way. For some reason, he's stamping everything he makes after the fact. Like after, while the pot is too dry to stamp it on the pot, or it's already been misfired, or for some reason, he's only stamping it later than you would normally stamp a pot. And we don't believe this potter is active anymore and has gone off to leave his apprenticeship under Bushuan and is now somebody else, and we don't know who. But they're very, very rarely seen and prized among Bushuan collectors. You can see traces of the Bushuan legacy here. He's really famous for doing what Tofukuji did with a single glaze by using multiple glazes and layering them for an effect that creates the same kind of effects that Tofukuji got using a single glaze. So yeah.
What would the valuation be?
170.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. This is clay. This is the clay color. This is Sanya tokenomic. And I actually mistranslated this kanji for like half a decade and had it wrong in my database, but it's right in there now. So if you had it down as something else, well, just look it up, because it's right. So it's just the clay. It's just the clay color. This is just the clay body. So this is Sanyo tokenomic. They were a production kiln, not active for a very long time, as best as I can tell, because you don't see them very often. But the quality is quite good. This is made in a traditional Japanese style mold. So there are Japanese style molds and Chinese style molds. And this is not like some kind of cultural difference. Like they're just mirror opposites of each other. And so are their artist marks. So there's a chop and a hanko. So you take a chop, stick it in the clay, you get a hanko. Take a hanko and stick it in the clay, you get a chop. One's raised letters and the other is indented letters. And it's the same thing with the molds they use. One is like a brick of plaster, and then you form clay around it. And you can decorate the outside and all this other stuff. And then the other, the Japanese way, is you have a mold and you're going to press clay into it. The Chinese way, I think you get cooler shapes and more external decoration. You get more solid containers that hold up better with the Japanese method. If we're picking favorites.
What kind of species would you put into that color?
So I would say this would work well with maybe something with darker green needles and limited deadwood. Definitely not anything with a lot of deadwood. It's too light. tough call. It doesn't complement any fruit that I can think of. Nor any features of conifers. You?
Not bad with
Yeah, dark green leaves. I can see that with an elm. Yeah, oak contrast well. Dark bark on the deciduous tree. That's good call. Yeah. It's right.
Thank you, Michael.